The abandoned cabin sat buried in 3 feet of snow, its windows black as dead eyes against the Montana wilderness. Sarah pulled her torn coat tighter around her swollen belly, her breath forming desperate clouds in the -20 air. She had nowhere else to run. Her boots crunched through the snow drifts as she approached the cabin's sagging porch. The wooden steps groaned under her weight, threatening to collapse entirely. Ice had formed a crystalline skin over every surface, turning the simple structure into something that belonged in a fairy tale, the kind where people died. Sarah's fingers, numb despite her threadbare gloves, fumbled with the rusted door handle. The metal bit into her skin through the worn fabric, but she persisted. The door shrieked open on frozen hinges, revealing an interior that looked like winter's graveyard. Moonlight streaming through broken windows illuminated a scene of complete devastation. Burst pipes had created abstract ice sculptures throughout the single room. The pot-bellied stove sat cold and black, its chimney pipe disconnected and lying across overturned furniture like a metallic snake. Rodent droppings dotted every surface, and the floorboards sagged ominously in several places. Most people would have turned around. Most people would have chosen to freeze in the open rather than die slowly in this ice tomb. But Sarah wasn't most people. She stepped inside, her trained eye automatically cataloging resources and problems. The roof appeared intact. No snow piles on the floor meant the structure was sound overhead. The stone foundation looked solid, just old. Most importantly, the stove seemed functional despite being disconnected. Sarah shrugged off her backpack, one of the few possessions she'd managed to grab during her desperate flight. Inside were basic tools, some canned food, and the last of her cash, everything that remained of her former life. She pulled out a small LED flashlight and began her assessment. The cabin measured roughly 12 by 16 feet, one room, one chance at survival. The burst pipes were a problem but not insurmountable. She could cap them and melt snow for water. The broken windows would need immediate attention. Cardboard and duct tape from her pack would have to suffice until she found better materials. Her baby shifted restlessly, and Sarah placed a protective hand over her belly. 7 months pregnant and running for her life, it wasn't how she'd imagined motherhood beginning. The child's father was dead, killed 3 weeks ago when he'd tried to help her escape Marcus's reach. Now she carried their baby alone into an uncertain future. Marcus. Even thinking his name made her jaw clench. Her ex-husband had seemed charming once, successful and confident. She'd been young and naive, fresh out of the army and looking for stability. By the time she'd discovered his connections to the Sinaloa cartel's money laundering operations, she'd been trapped in a marriage that felt more like a prison sentence. The night she'd witnessed Marcus execute her sister Elena had been her breaking point. Elena had threatened to expose his illegal activities unless he left Sarah alone. Instead of backing down, Marcus had put a bullet in Elena's head and made it look like a robbery gone wrong. Sarah had been hiding in Elena's closet, waiting to surprise her sister with news of the pregnancy. Instead, she'd watched her only family member die and knew she was next. A gust of wind rattled the cabin's frame, snapping Sarah back to immediate concerns. Survival first, revenge later. She'd learned that lesson in Afghanistan's unforgiving mountains. Moving with efficient purpose, Sarah began sealing the broken windows with cardboard and tape. Each piece she secured blocked out more of the killing cold. Next, she tackled the stovepipe, wrestling the heavy metal back into position and checking the chimney for obstructions. Her breath still misted in the frigid air, but the sealed space already felt marginally warmer. Sarah gathered scattered wooden furniture, a broken chair, some shelving, scraps of lumber, and began building a fire. The kindling caught quickly, and soon orange flames were dancing behind the stove's glass door. The transformation was immediate. Light pushed back the shadows, and blessed heat began radiating outward. Sarah pulled off her gloves and held her hands toward the warmth, feeling sensation return to her fingertips. She allowed herself 30 seconds of relief before returning to work. The floor needed insulation. She dragged a moldy mattress from the corner and positioned it near the stove. Her sleeping bag would provide another layer between her and the cold. As she worked, Sarah's mind stayed alert for sounds that didn't belong. Marcus had resources, connections, and unlimited patience. He would come for her eventually, but hopefully not tonight. Tonight she just needed to survive until morning. The baby kicked again, stronger this time, as if approving of the warming shelter. Sarah smiled grimly and added another piece of furniture to the fire. She'd built forward operating bases in hostile territory before. This frozen cabin would become her fortress, and she'd make it impregnable. Outside, the Montana wind howled like something hunting. The cabin door slammed shut behind Maya with a finality that made her stomach clench. She pressed her back against the rough wood, breathing hard from the climb, her hand instinctively moving to cradle her belly. 6 months along, and every step up that treacherous mountain path had felt like a marathon. Dust motes danced in the pale afternoon light filtering through grimy windows. The single room stretched before her. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, flanked by empty shelves that had probably once held canned goods and supplies. A rusted iron bed frame sat in the far corner, its bare springs crying out for a mattress that was long gone. The floorboards creaked ominously under her weight as she took tentative steps inside. This wasn't exactly the safe haven she'd imagined during the 3-hour hike, but it would have to do. At least it had 4 walls and a roof that appeared mostly intact, though she could see daylight peeking through gaps in several places. Maya's phone buzzed in her jacket pocket, making her jump. She pulled it out with trembling fingers, her heart hammering as she read the display. Unknown number. The device vibrated insistently in her palm, and she could almost hear Marcus's voice on the other end, smooth and threatening in that way that had taken her too long to recognize as dangerous. She powered off the phone and yanked out the battery with more force than necessary. The plastic casing cracked, but she didn't care. They couldn't track what wasn't transmitting. Her legs gave out, and she sank onto the dusty floor, finally allowing herself to acknowledge the magnitude of what she'd done. 24 hours ago, she'd been Maya Castellanos, respected forensic accountant with a corner office and a retirement plan. Now she was a woman with no last name, carrying the evidence that could destroy one of the city's most powerful crime families, and the man she'd once thought she loved. The baby kicked, a sharp reminder that she wasn't just running for her own life anymore. She pressed both hands to her stomach, feeling the solid reality of the tiny person depending on her to make the right choices. "Sorry, little one," she whispered. "Mommy made some really stupid mistakes." The wind picked up outside, rattling the windows and sending a chill through the gaps in the walls. Maya pulled her jacket tighter and surveyed her meager supplies. 1 bottle of water, half empty. A granola bar she'd grabbed from her desk drawer, $43 in cash, and a credit card she couldn't use without broadcasting her location to anyone looking for her. She'd been so focused on running that she hadn't thought past reaching the cabin. Her father had brought her here twice as a child, back when he'd still been trying to connect with his daughter after the divorce. She remembered him teaching her to start a fire, showing her which berries were safe to eat, pointing out animal tracks in the mud by the creek. At 8 years old, it had seemed like an adventure. At 29, and pregnant, it felt like a death sentence. But she was alive, which was more than she could say if she'd stayed in the city. The memory of finding those files on Marcus's laptop still made her nauseous. Page after page of financial records detailing money laundering, operations, offshore accounts, and payments to judges and police officials. She'd thought she was dating a successful businessman who owned a chain of restaurants. Instead, she'd been sleeping with the financial architect of a criminal empire. A branch scraped against the window, sharp and sudden like fingernails on glass. Maya's head snapped toward the sound, her pulse spiking. Just the wind, she told herself. Just the mountains settling in for evening. No one could have followed her here. She'd been careful, taken back roads, paid for gas with cash. She'd even abandoned her car 5 miles down the mountain and hiked the rest of the way on foot. Still, she found herself moving to the window and peering through the grime at the forest beyond. Tall pines swayed in the breeze, their dark branches creating shifting shadows that could hide anything, or anyone. The baby kicked again, harder this time, as if sensing her anxiety. Maya forced herself to breathe slowly, in and out, the way she'd learned in those prenatal classes she'd been attending with such naive optimism just a week ago. First things first, she needed to make this place livable for the night. Tomorrow she could figure out her next move, maybe hike down to the ranger station and find a way to contact the FBI field office in Denver. But tonight, she just needed to survive. Maya pushed herself to her feet and walked to the fireplace. A few charred logs remained from the last occupant, and she could see kindling stacked beside the hearth. Her father's voice echoed in her memory. Fire first, shelter second, everything else comes after. She knelt and began building the foundation for what she hoped wouldn't be her last campfire. The crackling fire cast dancing shadows across the cabin walls as Maya wrapped her hands around the chipped ceramic mug, savoring the warmth seeping through her palms. The herbal tea, made from dried leaves she'd found in a mason jar, tasted bitter, but it was hot, and that was enough. Outside, the wind howled through the pine trees, a sound that should have been comforting but instead made her jump at every creak and groan of the old structure. She'd been here 3 days now, and the constant state of alertness was wearing her down. Every snapped twig, every rustle of leaves sent her heart racing. She couldn't shake the feeling that Marcus was out there somewhere, methodically searching, following whatever breadcrumbs she might have left behind. He was nothing if not thorough, a trait that had once made her feel protected before she understood what it really meant. The baby kicked, a sharp jab against her ribs that made her gasp and nearly spill her tea. She placed her free hand on her belly, feeling the firm outline of what might be an elbow or a knee. "I know, little one," she whispered. "This isn't exactly the nursery I planned for you." She'd been 28 weeks along when she fled. Now, every day brought her closer to a reality she wasn't prepared to face, giving birth alone, in the wilderness, with no medical help and a madman possibly closing in. The thought sent ice through her veins despite the fire's warmth. Maya forced herself to focus on immediate concerns. Food was becoming an issue. The canned goods she'd found would last maybe another week if she rationed carefully. There had to be a town somewhere within walking distance, or driving distance, if she could figure out how to start the rusted pickup truck she'd spotted in the cabin's lean-to shed. She'd explored the property more thoroughly today, moving carefully through the trees despite her growing belly. The cabin sat in a natural clearing about 2 acres wide, surrounded by dense forest that could hide her from prying eyes, or hide threats she wouldn't see coming until it was too late. A narrow dirt road led away from the property, disappearing into the trees. She'd followed it for about a quarter mile before exhaustion forced her to turn back. The truck was her best hope. It was an ancient Ford, probably from the 70s, with rust eating through the wheel wells and a cracked windshield. But the tires held air, and when she'd popped the hood, the engine looked intact. She'd grown up watching her father tinker with engines in their garage, back when life was simple and her biggest worry was passing algebra. Tomorrow she'd try to get it running. She had to. Staying hidden was one thing, but she couldn't hide forever. Eventually she'd need supplies, medical care, help, and despite the fear that gnawed at her constantly, she was starting to feel something else: anger. Marcus had driven her to this. Her hand unconsciously moved to her left wrist, where the bruises had finally faded, but the memory lingered sharp and clear. She'd covered for him so many times, made excuses, convinced herself that his controlling behavior came from love, from worry about her safety. It had taken finding the photographs, dozens of them, taken without her knowledge, documenting her every move, to shatter that delusion completely. The fire popped, sending sparks up the chimney, and Maya startled so hard she nearly dropped her mug. Her nerves were frayed, stretched to the breaking point. She needed sleep, but sleep meant vulnerability, and vulnerability could mean death. She'd developed a system over the past few nights, wedging the door shut with a chair, positioning empty cans near the windows so they'd rattle if disturbed, keeping the poker from the fireplace within arm's reach. It wasn't much, but it was something. The wind died down suddenly, and in the relative quiet, she heard something that made her blood freeze. The distant sound of an engine growing closer. Maya moved as quickly as her pregnant body would allow, dousing the fire with the remaining tea and grabbing the poker. The cabin plunged into darkness just as headlights swept across the trees outside. She pressed herself against the wall beside the window, heart hammering so loud she was sure it would give her away. The engine stopped. A car door slammed. Footsteps crunched on gravel, moving slowly, deliberately around the perimeter of the cabin. This was it. Somehow, impossibly, Marcus had found her. 3 days of imagined safety crumbled in an instant. Maya gripped the poker tighter, knowing it would be useless against him, but needing something solid in her hands. The footsteps stopped directly outside the front door. A knock echoed through the silence, 3 sharp raps that seemed to reverberate in her bones. Then a voice, gravelly and unfamiliar. "I know you're in there, miss. Don't be afraid. I'm here to help." The wind had died to a whisper by dawn, but the cold remained merciless. Sarah's breath came in sharp puffs as she crouched beside the window, peering through a gap in the boards she'd nailed up the night before. The valley stretched below like a white grave, unmarked except for her own footprints leading up from the tree line. No new tracks. Yet, her stomach cramped with hunger, a hollow ache that seemed to echo the baby's restless movements. She pressed a hand to her belly, feeling the familiar flutter of tiny limbs. 6 months along, and already the child seemed to sense her fear, growing more active when her heart raced. "We're okay," she whispered to the darkness inside her coat. "We're going to be okay." The lie tasted bitter on her cracked lips. She'd rationed the granola bars to last 3 days, but her body was burning through calories trying to stay warm. The baby needed more. She needed more. The cabin's previous occupant had left behind some canned goods, but they were old, rust eating at the labels, contents questionable at best. Still, beggars couldn't afford to be particular. Sarah pried open a can of what might have been soup, the metal protesting with a grinding screech that seemed to echo through the empty rooms. The smell that emerged made her gag, but she forced herself to taste it anyway. Spoiled, definitely spoiled. She set the can aside and continued her inventory. 3 more cans of unknown contents, a bag of flour that mice had gotten into, and a jar of honey that had crystallized to the consistency of amber. The honey, at least, was still good. She ate it slowly, letting the sweetness dissolve on her tongue while she planned her next move. The nearest town was 15 miles down a winding mountain road that would be impassable on foot in this weather. But there had to be other cabins, other seasonal homes where she might find supplies. Rich folks from the city often kept places like this stocked for their weekend getaways. The trick would be finding them without leaving a trail that Marcus could follow. Marcus. Even thinking his name made her shoulder throb where he'd grabbed her during their last fight, his fingers digging in hard enough to leave bruises that were only now fading to yellow-green. He'd been getting worse since she told him about the baby, his control slipping in ways that terrified her. The pregnancy was supposed to be good news. Instead, it had become another chain binding her to him. She touched her phone, still turned off in her pocket. Turning it on would be suicide. He could track it in minutes. But the temptation to call her sister, to hear a friendly voice, was almost overwhelming. Rachel would help if she could, but she had her own kids to protect. Sarah wouldn't put them at risk too. A sound from outside froze her blood, the distant rumble of an engine growing closer. Sarah scrambled to the window, pressing her eye to the gap. A dark SUV was climbing the access road, moving slowly through the snow. Her breath caught. It looked like Marcus's Range Rover, but she was too far away to be certain. The vehicle stopped at the bottom of the trail leading to her cabin. Too far to drive, but close enough that whoever was inside would spot her footprints immediately. The driver's door opened, and a figure stepped out, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing the black wool coat she'd bought Marcus for Christmas 2 years ago. Her hands shook as she backed away from the window. He'd found her. Somehow, Impossibly, he'd tracked her to this god-forsaken place in the middle of nowhere. Think. She had to think. The cabin had a back door leading to a small porch that overlooked a steep slope. If she could make it to the trees without being seen, she might have a chance. But the snow was deep, and she was already exhausted from the cold and hunger. In her condition, running through the wilderness was nearly as dangerous as staying to face him. The baby kicked hard, as if sensing her panic. Sarah placed both hands on her belly, trying to calm herself. Panic would get them both killed. She gathered what little she had, the remaining granola bars, the honey, her small knife. Her boots were still damp from yesterday, but there was no time to worry about that now. She could hear Marcus calling her name, his voice carrying across the snow with false sweetness that made her skin crawl. "Sarah, I know you're here, baby. Your car's at the bottom of the mountain. Come on out, let's talk about this." The endearment was a weapon in his mouth, sharp with implied violence. She'd heard that same tone before he'd put his fist through the wall beside her head, before he'd locked her in their bedroom for 3 days, before he'd started monitoring her every move. Sarah eased the back door open and stepped into the blinding white morning, leaving the safety of walls and roof for the uncertain mercy of the wilderness. The storm had passed, leaving behind a crystalline silence that made every sound amplify tenfold. Sarah pressed her ear against the cabin's front window, straining to hear beyond the gentle drip of melting snow from the eaves. 3 days of relative peace had lulled her into a dangerous sense of security, but the baby's restless movements reminded her that time was running out in more ways than one. She'd managed to fashion a crude inventory of her resources: half a sleeve of stale crackers, 2 cans of beans with no opener, a rusty pot, and enough firewood to last maybe another week if she rationed carefully. The hunting knife she'd found would have to serve multiple purposes: can opener, protection, and tool. Her growing belly made every task more challenging, and she found herself pausing frequently to catch her breath. The sound of an engine in the distance froze her blood. Sarah dropped to her knees below the window frame, heart hammering against her ribs. The rumble grew closer. Definitely a truck, maybe 2. She crawled across the floor to the back room, where she'd already identified an escape route through a loose board in the wall. Her hands shook as she listened to the vehicle's approach, their engines growing louder until they seemed to stop just beyond the tree line. Car doors slammed. Voices carried on the thin mountain air, too distant to make out words but close enough to confirm her worst fears. They'd found her. She gathered her few possessions with trembling hands: the knife, her jacket, the crackers. Everything else would have to stay. Through a crack in the back wall, she could see the forest stretching endlessly upward, a maze of pine and shadow that could either hide her or become her tomb. The front door rattled. Sarah didn't wait to see if it would hold. She squeezed through the loose board, splinters catching her clothes and skin, and stumbled into the snow behind the cabin. The cold hit her like a physical blow, but she forced herself to move, staying low as she made for the nearest cluster of trees. "Check around back," a voice called from the front of the cabin. Male, authoritative, familiar in a way that made her stomach lurch. She pressed herself against a massive pine, trying to control her ragged breathing. The baby kicked hard, as if sensing her terror. Through the trees she could see 2 men in dark coats, methodically searching the cabin's perimeter. One of them spoke into a radio, his words lost in the wind. Moving from tree to tree, Sarah began a desperate ascent up the mountainside. Each step sent snow cascading around her feet, and she prayed the forest was thick enough to mask the sound. Her legs burned, her lungs ached in the thin air, but the voices behind her kept her moving. "Fresh ashes in the fireplace," someone called out. She was here recently. The confirmation that they knew her hiding spot sent a fresh surge of adrenaline through her system. She pushed deeper into the forest, branches tearing at her hair and jacket. The terrain grew steeper, more treacherous, but she couldn't stop. Not now. A sharp crack echoed through the trees, a branch breaking under someone's weight. They were following her trail. Sarah's foot caught on a hidden root, sending her tumbling into a shallow ravine filled with snow and dead leaves. She landed hard, pain shooting through her side as the baby protested the rough treatment. For a moment, she lay still, listening for sounds of pursuit. The forest had gone quiet again. She hauled herself up, using a fallen log for support, and found herself facing a choice. The ravine stretched in two directions. One led further up the mountain into unknown territory, the other curved back toward the valley and possible civilization. Both paths were fraught with danger, but staying put wasn't an option. The sound of snow crunching under boots made the decision for her. She chose the upward path, following the ravine as it wound between towering evergreens. Her breath came in white puffs that she tried to minimize, knowing they could give away her position. The baby's movements had settled into an uneasy rhythm, and she wondered how much stress her body could take before something gave way. Behind her, voices called back and forth through the trees, coordinating their search, professional, systematic. They weren't giving up easily. As the afternoon light began to fade, Sarah realized she faced a new problem. Night was coming, the temperature was dropping, and she was alone in the wilderness with no shelter and minimal supplies. The men hunting her had radios, backup, probably thermal equipment that would make her body heat a beacon in the darkness. She touched her belly protectively and whispered a promise to the child within. Whatever it took, whoever was after them, she would find a way to survive. She had to. The sound of her pursuers was growing fainter, but she knew they hadn't given up. They were regrouping, planning, preparing for a longer hunt. And she would be ready for them. The storm hit just after midnight, turning the world outside into a howling white nightmare. Maya jolted awake as wind rattled the cabin's windows with such violence she feared they might shatter. Snow pelted against the glass like angry fists, and the temperature inside plummeted despite the dying embers in the fireplace. She struggled to her feet, one hand pressed against her lower back, where a persistent ache had been growing stronger each day. The baby seemed restless too, shifting and pressing against her ribs as if sensing the danger brewing outside. Maya fed more wood to the fire, grateful she'd spent the previous day gathering every fallen branch she could find. By dawn, the storm had dumped nearly 2 feet of fresh snow, transforming the landscape into an impenetrable white fortress. Maya stood at the window, watching the wind sculpt massive drifts against the trees. The path she'd worn between the cabin and the creek had vanished completely. Even worse, she could no longer see the creek itself, just an endless expanse of white. Her water reserves wouldn't last another day. Maya bundled herself in every layer she could find, wrapping her feet in torn strips of blanket before pulling on the oversized boots she'd discovered in the cabin's closet. The cold hit her like a physical blow the moment she stepped outside. Her breath formed ice crystals that stung her cheeks, and the snow crunched ominously beneath her feet. She'd taken only a dozen steps when her foot broke through the surface, plunging her leg knee-deep into a hidden drift. Panic flared as she struggled to pull free, the snow collapsing around her like quicksand. The extra weight of her pregnancy threw off her balance, and she nearly fell face-first into the white void. After what felt like hours but was probably only 20 minutes, Maya reached what she hoped was the creek. The familiar sound of running water was muffled beneath a thick layer of ice and snow. She knelt carefully, using a broken branch to chip away at the frozen surface. Her hands were numb within minutes, but she kept working until she broke through to the dark water below. The journey back to the cabin proved even more treacherous. The wind had erased her footprints, leaving her to navigate by instinct through the transformed landscape. Twice, she lost her way completely, standing motionless in the swirling snow until she spotted the cabin's dark outline through the trees. Inside, Maya's relief was short-lived. As she peeled off her frozen layers, she noticed dark spots on the blanket strips wrapped around her feet, blood. The makeshift boots had rubbed her feet raw, and frostbite was already turning her toes an alarming shade of white. She spent the rest of the morning treating her injuries as best she could, melting snow for warm water and massaging feeling back into her extremities. The baby had been unusually quiet during her ordeal, which worried her almost as much as her own deteriorating condition. By afternoon, the storm had intensified again. Maya rationed her food carefully, a handful of berries, some pine needle tea, and the last of the fish she'd managed to catch before the weather turned. Her stomach cramped with hunger, but she forced herself to save the rest for tomorrow. As evening approached, she heard something that made her blood freeze, the distant sound of an engine. Maya pressed herself against the window, straining to see through the snow. The sound came and went on the wind, sometimes seeming close, sometimes fading entirely. A snowmobile, maybe two. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she remembered the helicopter from days before. They were still looking for her. She moved through the cabin quickly, extinguishing the fire and covering the windows with blankets. In the sudden darkness, every sound seemed amplified. The groaning of the cabin's old timbers, the whistle of wind through gaps in the walls, her own rapid breathing. The engine sounds grew closer. Maya crouched beside the window, lifting one corner of the blanket to peer out. Through the swirling snow she caught glimpses of headlights sweeping back and forth across the mountainside. They were searching methodically, following what might have been old logging roads or hiking trails beneath the snow. The baby chose that moment to deliver a sharp kick to her ribs, and Maya bit back a gasp of pain. She placed both hands on her belly, trying to will the child to stillness. Not now. Please, not now. One set of headlights swept closer to the cabin, close enough that she could hear the snowmobile's engine clearly over the storm. Maya held her breath as the light passed over the cabin's walls, lingering for a terrifying moment on the window where she crouched. Then the sound began to fade, moving away up the mountain. Maya remained frozen in position long after the engines disappeared entirely, listening to nothing but wind and her own thundering heartbeat. When she finally allowed herself to breathe normally again, she realized that her situation had become impossibly more desperate. The storm was trapping her, slowly starving and freezing her to death. But the moment it cleared, they would be back. She was running out of time, running out of options, and running out of strength to keep fighting for two lives instead of one. The sound of helicopters had grown distant, but Maya knew better than to trust the silence. She pressed herself against the cabin's back wall, watching through a crack in the wood as shadows moved between the trees. 3 figures in dark clothing swept through the forest with military precision, their movements coordinated and purposeful. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she recognized the lead figure's distinctive gait. Sarah Chen, Victor's head of security. The man who had once smiled at her across conference room tables now moved like a predator, his weapon drawn and ready. Behind him, 2 other operatives spread out in a practiced search pattern. Maya's hand instinctively went to her belly. The baby had been unusually quiet today, as if sensing the danger that surrounded them. She couldn't afford to be discovered now, not when she was this close to reaching the safe house coordinates hidden in her father's journal. Through the gap in the wall, she watched Marcus signal to his team. They were moving away from the cabin, heading toward the rocky outcropping where she'd hidden yesterday. Her breath caught. Had she left tracks? Evidence of her presence? The floorboard beneath her foot creaked, and she froze. The sound seemed impossibly loud in the stillness. Marcus stopped mid-stride, his head tilting as he listened. Maya held her breath, willing herself to become part of the shadows. After what felt like an eternity, Marcus continued his sweep, but Maya could see the heightened alertness in his posture. He suspected something. She had to move, had to put distance between herself and the search team before they circled back. Carefully, she gathered her meager supplies, the journal, the knife, the water bottle she'd filled from the stream yesterday. Every movement had to be deliberate, silent. The baby shifted inside her, a gentle rolling motion that made her pause and place a protective hand over the growing curve of her abdomen. "I know you can hear me," she whispered, barely audible. "We're going to get through this, both of us." She crept toward the cabin's rear exit, the one partially hidden by overgrown brambles. The thorns caught at her jacket as she pushed through, but she bit back any sound of pain. Freedom lay on the other side of the thicket, where the forest grew dense enough to provide cover. The coordinates in her father's journal led to a location 3 miles northeast, deeper into the wilderness. Maya had studied the rough map he'd sketched, memorizing every landmark. A lightning-struck oak tree, a stream that split around a boulder shaped like a sleeping bear, and finally a cave system that her father had marked with 3 small crosses. As she emerged from the brambles, Maya heard voices behind her. Marcus was giving orders, his tone sharp and commanding. They'd found something, maybe her footprints from yesterday, or the small fire pit she'd hastily covered. She moved quickly but carefully through the trees, placing each step to avoid snapping twigs or rustling leaves. The forest seemed alive with danger, every shadow potentially hiding another of Victor's men. The pregnancy made her movements awkward, her center of gravity shifted, but desperation gave her grace. A radio crackled behind her, the sound carrying clearly through the thin mountain air. "Sector 7 clear." Moving to Sector 8. Another voice responded. "Thermal imaging shows possible heat signature northwest of your position." Maya's blood chilled. Thermal imaging meant they could track her body heat, even through the forest canopy. She needed to find water, something to mask her signature and throw them off her trail. The stream from yesterday was too far back, but she remembered seeing a smaller creek during her initial reconnaissance. If she could reach it, wade upstream for a significant distance, she might be able to break the trail and confuse the search pattern. Her father's journal felt heavy in her pocket, its pages containing not just coordinates, but fragments of a life she was only beginning to understand. Harrison Webb hadn't just been a successful businessman, he'd been running from something too, the same something that now hunted her. The sound of the helicopters returned, growing louder. Maya looked up through the canopy to see the dark silhouette passing overhead, its searchlight probing the forest floor. She pressed herself against the trunk of a massive pine, using its bulk to shield her from above. When the helicopter moved on, she resumed her careful progress through the wilderness. The baby kicked, a strong flutter that brought both joy and worry. She was 26 weeks along, far enough that the child might survive if something happened to her, but still vulnerable. The thought strengthened her resolve. Whatever Victor wanted, whatever her father had been involved in, it ended with her. She would reach the safe house, decode the rest of the journal's secrets, and find a way to disappear permanently. Her child would grow up free from this shadow war. Behind her, Marcus's voice echoed through the trees, closer now. They were gaining ground. The storm had passed, leaving behind a crystalline world that glittered dangerously in the morning sun. Sarah pressed her face to the frost-covered window, scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. The snow lay pristine and undisturbed, but she'd learned not to trust appearances. Her stomach cramped with hunger, a constant companion now that her meager supplies were dwindling. The baby seemed to sense her distress, shifting restlessly as if protesting the lack of nourishment. She placed a protective hand over her belly, whispering promises she wasn't sure she could keep. A distant rumble made her freeze. Not thunder. The sky was clear. The sound grew closer, mechanical and purposeful. Sarah's blood turned to ice as she recognized the distinctive whine of snowmobiles cutting through the mountain silence. They'd found her. Panic flooded her system as she stumbled away from the window, her mind racing through impossible options. The cabin offered no real hiding places, and running in her condition through deep snow would be suicide. The engine sounds multiplied, coming from different directions now, systematically searching the area. Sarah grabbed the rusty poker from beside the fireplace, its weight both comforting and pathetic in her trembling hands. She backed toward the bedroom, calculating distances and wondering if she could barricade herself inside long enough to... The engine stopped. The sudden silence was worse than the noise, pregnant with threat. Sarah held her breath, straining to hear footsteps or voices over the thundering of her own heart. Minutes crawled by with agonizing slowness. Maybe they'd moved on, following false leads to other abandoned structures scattered throughout these mountains. A board creaked on the front porch. Sarah bit back a whimper, pressing herself against the bedroom wall. Through the gaps in the old wood, she could hear muffled voices conferring in low tones. At least 2 men, maybe more. She couldn't make out words, but the tone was professional, methodical. Marcus had sent professionals. The front door rattled as someone tested the handle. Sarah had wedged a chair under it, but the old wood wouldn't hold long against determined force. Her eyes darted to the bedroom window, too small and too high for her to escape through quickly, especially pregnant. Footsteps circled the cabin now, testing weak points, checking sight lines. These weren't random searchers stumbling through the wilderness. They knew what they were doing, how to approach a potentially occupied building without alerting the occupants. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was already terrified. A shadow passed by the bedroom window, and Sarah caught a glimpse of tactical gear and a rifle barrel. Her knees nearly gave out. Marcus wasn't taking chances this time. Whatever she'd witnessed, whatever evidence she represented, it was worth killing for. The baby kicked hard, as if responding to her elevated heart rate. The movement was usually comforting, but now it served as a stark reminder of what she stood to lose. Not just her own life, but the innocent one growing inside her. More whispered conversation from outside, then silence again. Sarah waited, poker raised, muscles screaming from tension. Were they gone? Had they decided the cabin was empty and moved on to search elsewhere? The back door exploded inward with a crash that shook the entire structure. Sarah screamed despite herself, scrambling toward the front of the cabin as heavy boots thundered across the kitchen floor. She reached the main room just as two figures in winter camouflage appeared, weapons raised. Their faces were hidden behind tactical masks, but she could see their eyes, cold, professional, utterly without mercy. "Sarah Chen," the larger man said, his voice muffled but carrying absolute authority. "You've led us quite a chase." She backed against the front door, poker trembling in her grip. "I don't know what Marcus told you, but drop the weapon." The second man stepped sideways, creating a crossfire pattern. "We're not here to hurt you unnecessarily." The qualification in his words sent fresh terror through her veins. Unnecessarily, meaning they would hurt her if she didn't comply, if she made their job difficult. "The baby," she whispered, hoping to find some shred of humanity in these hired killers. "I'm pregnant." The larger man's eyes flickered with something, not quite sympathy, but perhaps recognition that their task had complications. "That's not our concern. Our job is to bring you back. Back to Marcus. Back to whatever fate awaited her in the city." Sarah knew with absolute certainty that if she left this cabin with these men, neither she nor her child would survive the journey. The poker felt impossibly heavy in her hands, but she raised it higher. No. Both men tensed, reading her desperation correctly. In the space of a heartbeat, Sarah saw their fingers move toward triggers, saw her death reflected in their tactical visors. Then the front window exploded behind her in a shower of glass and gunfire. The storm had passed, but Maya's relief was short-lived. Standing at the cabin window, she watched Marcus wade through knee-deep snow toward the front door, his expensive coat dark against the pristine white landscape. Behind him, two more figures emerged from the tree line, shadows she recognized even at a distance, Vincent's men. Her hands moved instinctively to her belly, where the baby kicked as if sensing her terror. 8 months along, she was in no condition to run. Not through snow this deep, not anywhere. "I know you're in there, Maya." Marcus's voice carried easily through the thin walls. "Your tracks led us right here." She pressed her back against the wall beside the window, mind racing. The rifle leaned against the far wall where she'd left it after the storm, but 3 against 1 weren't odds she liked, especially not with Marcus involved. Vincent's brother had always been the more dangerous of the two, patient where Vincent was impulsive, calculating where Vincent was brutal. "We just want to talk," Marcus continued, his tone conversational. "About the baby. About what happens next." Maya's blood ran cold. They knew about the pregnancy. Of course they did. Vincent had probably figured it out before she'd even fled Chicago. The timing, her sudden desire to disappear. It wouldn't have taken long for him to do the math. "Nobody has to get hurt here," Marcus called out. "But we're not leaving without you." She crept toward the rifle, floorboards groaning under her weight despite her careful movements. The sound seemed to echo like thunder in the silence, and she froze, holding her breath. A soft thud came from the back of the cabin, then another. They were surrounding the place. Maya reached the rifle and checked the chamber with trembling fingers. 3 bullets left. She'd used the rest hunting rabbits over the past weeks, never imagining she'd need them for this. Her hands shook as she tried to remember everything her father had taught her about shooting during those long summers at her grandmother's farm. "Maya, sweetheart." This voice was different, smoother, more familiar. Vincent himself. Her ex-husband had arrived. "You've led us quite a chase, but it's time to come home." The back door handle rattled softly. Someone was testing it, seeing if it was locked. Maya had thrown the bolt that morning out of habit, but the wood was old and rotted. It wouldn't hold long against a determined shoulder. "Think about the baby," Vincent continued from the front porch. "You can't raise a child out here in the wilderness. What kind of life is that?" Maya almost laughed at the irony. What kind of life was growing up with a father who laundered money for drug cartels and eliminated anyone who threatened his operations? She'd seen enough of Vincent's business meetings to know exactly what kind of father he'd be. A sharp crack came from the rear of the cabin. The back door's frame was splintering. Maya moved to the corner where she could see both entrances, rifle raised but not yet aimed. Her heart hammered against her ribs, and the baby seemed to sense the tension shifting restlessly inside her. "Last chance, Maya," Vincent called out. "Walk out that front door, and we can work something out. Maybe joint custody, maybe visitation rights. But if you make us come in there—" The threat hung in the air like smoke. Maya knew Vincent well enough to understand what he wasn't saying. There would be no negotiation if they had to take her by force. There would be no custody arrangements or visitation schedules. There would only be Vincent's version of control, which looked a lot like a cage. The back door burst open, and a figure in white winter gear stepped through, assault rifle in hand. Maya didn't hesitate. She fired, the recoil jarring her shoulder and sending pain shooting down her spine. The man stumbled backward, clutching his arm, but didn't go down. "That was a mistake," Vincent roared from outside. The front door exploded inward as Marcus kicked it off its hinges. Maya swung the rifle toward him and fired again, but her hands were shaking too badly. The shot went wide, splintering the door frame inches from his head. Marcus dove to the side, pulling a pistol from inside his coat. "Take her alive," he shouted to the wounded man at the back door. "Vincent wants the baby born healthy." 1 bullet left, 3 men still standing, though one was bleeding. Maya's options were running out as fast as her ammunition. The baby kicked hard, as if protesting the violence surrounding them both. Maya's breath came in short gasps as she realized the terrible mathematics of her situation. She couldn't win this fight, not with a rifle against trained killers. But maybe she didn't have to win. Maybe she just had to survive long enough to find another option. She backed toward the stone fireplace, rifle still raised, and tried to remember if there were any other weapons hidden in the cabin she hadn't discovered yet. The sound of helicopter blades cutting through mountain air sent ice through Maya's veins. She pressed herself against the cabin's back wall, clutching the rifle Marcus had taught her to use, her pregnant belly making it awkward to find cover behind the woodpile. 3 days had passed since Marcus left for supplies. 3 days of jumping at every snapped twig, every bird call that seemed too close. Now her worst fears materialized in the mechanical thunder above. The helicopter circled twice before landing in the clearing beyond the tree line. Maya counted 4 figures emerging from the aircraft, too far to make out faces, but their purposeful movements told her everything. These weren't park rangers or search and rescue. These were Vincent's men. Her hands trembled as she checked the rifle's chamber. Marcus had drilled her on this weapon until she could load and fire it in her sleep, but knowing how to shoot targets was different from pointing a gun at another human being. The baby kicked hard against her ribs, as if sensing her terror. Moving carefully, Maya crept toward the cabin's back window. The men had split into pairs, approaching from 2 directions, professional, coordinated. They knew what they were doing. She had maybe 10 minutes before they reached the cabin. Maya grabbed the emergency pack Marcus had prepared: water, dried food, basic medical supplies, and ammunition. Her swollen fingers fumbled with the straps as she secured it to her back. At 7 months pregnant, running through wilderness wasn't just difficult, it was potentially deadly. But staying meant certain death. The back door creaked as she eased it open. Every sound seemed amplified in the mountain stillness. She could hear voices now, still distant but growing closer. One man was giving instructions in clipped, professional tones. Maya slipped into the forest behind the cabin, following the narrow game trail Marcus had shown her during their reconnaissance walks. Each step sent shooting pains through her lower back, but she forced herself to move steadily, avoiding the dried leaves and branches that would announce her presence. Behind her, she heard the front door splinter. "She was here," a voice called out. Still warm coffee on the stove. Maya's breath caught. She'd been drinking tea that morning, not coffee. They were guessing, hoping to rattle her if she was listening. The realization that they were using psychological tactics made her even more afraid. These weren't simple muscle, they were trained hunters. The game trail curved upward along the mountainside. Maya's lungs burned as she climbed, her body already exhausted from months of poor nutrition and constant stress. The baby seemed heavier with each step, throwing off her balance on the uneven terrain. A shout erupted from the cabin behind her. They'd found the back door open. Maya abandoned stealth for speed, crashing through underbrush as branches tore at her clothes and face. Blood ran warm down her cheek, but she couldn't stop. The trail forked ahead, one path continuing up the mountain, the other descending toward the valley. Marcus had told her to go up if she ever had to run. Higher ground, better visibility, harder for vehicles to follow. But her body screamed for the easier descent. She chose the mountain path. The sound of pursuit grew behind her, boots on stone, voices coordinating. They were gaining ground. Maya's vision blurred with exhaustion and pain. Her water had broken during other emergencies before, false alarms that sent her into panic, but the pressure building in her abdomen now felt different. Real. Not now. Please, not now. A gunshot cracked through the air, followed by shouting. Maya dove behind a cluster of boulders, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might burst. Had they seen her? Was Marcus back? More gunfire, but not directed at her position. Maya risked a glance around the rocks and saw muzzle flashes in the trees below. Someone else was in the fight. Marcus. Relief flooded through her, followed immediately by terror for his safety. She could hear him moving through the forest, using guerrilla tactics to harass the search team, but he was outnumbered 4-1. The helicopter engines roared to life again. Maya realized with growing horror that they were repositioning to flush her out from above while the ground team drove her toward them. It was a classic pincer movement, and she was caught in the middle. She had to keep moving. The trail ahead disappeared into thick pine forest. Maya pushed herself up from the rocks, every muscle protesting. Behind her, the gun battle continued, Marcus buying her precious time with his life. As she stumbled into the trees, Maya felt warm liquid running down her legs. Her hands went instinctively to her belly as another wave of pressure built and released. This wasn't a false alarm. Her body had decided that in the middle of a life-or-death chase, 7 months into her pregnancy, it was time for her baby to be born. The storm had passed, leaving behind a crystalline silence that made every sound echo like a gunshot. Maya pressed her face against the frost-covered window, watching the pristine snow that now buried the cabin's porch steps. 3 days had passed since she'd heard the voices in the woods, and the isolation was becoming its own kind of torture. Her stomach cramped with hunger, a sharp reminder that the remaining canned goods wouldn't last another week. The baby seemed to sense her distress, moving restlessly beneath her ribs. She placed both hands on her belly, whispering reassurances she didn't believe herself. A distant rumble broke the morning quiet. Maya's blood turned to ice as she recognized the sound. Snowmobiles, their engines growing louder with each passing second. She stumbled backward from the window, her heart hammering against her chest. They had found her. The sound multiplied, becoming a chorus of mechanical growls that seemed to surround the cabin. Maya grabbed the hunting knife from the kitchen counter and pressed herself against the wall beside the front door. Through the gap in the curtains, she caught glimpses of black-clad figures dismounting from their machines, their movements coordinated and purposeful. One of them raised his hand, signaling the others to spread out around the cabin's perimeter. Maya recognized the gesture, the tactical precision. These weren't local law enforcement or search and rescue. These were Marcus's people, and they had come to finish what they'd started. A voice boomed across the clearing, amplified by a megaphone. "Maya Rodriguez, we know you're in there. Come out with your hands visible and no one gets hurt." Maya almost laughed at the lie. Marcus didn't leave loose ends, and she carried the biggest secret of all. The baby kicked as if responding to the tension, and Maya pressed her lips together to stifle a sob. "You have 30 seconds, the voice continued. "Then we come in." Maya's mind raced through her options. The back door led to an exposed clearing, suicide. The root cellar might hide her, but they'd tear the place apart looking. Her gaze fell on the fireplace, remembering the damaged chimney stone. If she could somehow... The front door exploded inward, splinters of wood flying across the room. 3 figures in tactical gear poured through the opening, assault rifles raised. Maya pressed herself deeper into the shadow beside the doorframe, holding her breath. "Clear the back rooms," one of them ordered, his voice muffled by a helmet. "Check everything. She's pregnant, she can't have gone far." As they moved deeper into the cabin, Maya slipped around the doorframe and out into the snow. The cold bit through her clothes like needles, but she forced herself to move. The snowmobiles sat abandoned near the tree line, their engines still ticking with residual heat. She made it halfway to the machines before a shout erupted from the cabin. "She's not here! Check the perimeter!" Maya broke into a stumbling run, her boots sinking deep into the snow with each step. The extra weight of pregnancy threw off her balance, and she fell face first into a drift. Snow filled her mouth and nose as she struggled to her feet, gasping. Boots crunched behind her, moving fast. "There! Northwest side!" A gunshot cracked across the mountainside, and bark exploded from a tree inches from Maya's head. She dove behind a fallen log, her hands instinctively protecting her belly. The baby had gone still, as if sensing the danger. "Take her alive!" someone shouted. "The boss wants to handle this personally." Maya crawled along the log, using it as cover. Ahead, the forest grew thicker, offering better concealment but more treacherous footing. Another shot rang out, this one closer, and Maya heard the distinctive whine of a ricochet. She reached the end of the log and risked a glance back. 4 men were advancing through the snow, their weapons trained on her position. In the distance, she could see more figures emerging from the cabin, carrying equipment she didn't recognize. Taking a deep breath, Maya pushed herself up and sprinted for the tree line. Her lungs burned in the thin mountain air, and her legs felt like lead weights, but terror drove her forward. She could hear them behind her, closing the distance with their longer strides and superior conditioning. The forest swallowed her, its shadows offering temporary refuge. Maya pressed herself against a massive pine, her chest heaving. Blood from a dozen small cuts stained the snow at her feet, and her jeans were soaked through from the knee down. Voices echoed through the trees, coordinating the search. They were spreading out, forming a net to trap her. Maya closed her eyes and tried to think. She knew these mountains better now, had walked these trails for weeks, but they had equipment, training, and numbers. The baby moved again, a gentle flutter against her ribs. Maya opened her eyes, jaw set with determination. They might catch her, but she wouldn't make it easy, not when 2 lives hung in the balance. She pushed away from the tree and continued deeper into the wilderness. The blood on the snow told a story Maya didn't want to read. 3 sets of footprints led away from the cabin toward the tree line, but only 2 came back. She crouched beside the dark stains, her breath forming small clouds in the frigid air as she tried to piece together what had happened during the night. She'd heard the gunshot around midnight. a sharp crack that had jolted her from restless sleep. Then voices, men calling to each other through the darkness. She'd pressed herself against the cabin wall, one hand on her swollen belly, the other gripping the rusted poker from the fireplace. But the sounds had moved away deeper into the forest, and eventually silence had returned. Now, in the pale morning light, she could see the aftermath. Someone had been hurt, maybe killed, and whoever did it was still out there. The baby kicked hard against her ribs, as if sensing her distress. Maya winced and straightened, scanning the forest for any sign of movement. The trees stood silent and still, their branches heavy with fresh snow from the storm that had passed through during the night. Everything looked peaceful, pristine even, except for those damning red splotches marking the white ground. She followed the returning footprints with her eyes. They led directly to the old hunting blind she'd spotted on her second day here, a weathered wooden structure built into the hillside about 50 yards from the cabin. She'd avoided it, thinking it was just another relic from when this place had been used for recreation instead of refuge. Now she realized her mistake. Someone had been watching her. Maya's pulse quickened as she backed toward the cabin door. She needed to leave, pack what little she had and find another place to hide. But as she turned, a figure stepped out from behind the woodshed. "Easy there," the man said, raising both hands to show he was unarmed. He was older than she'd expected, maybe 60, with grey stubble and kind eyes that reminded her of her father. His jacket was torn at the shoulder, and dried blood crusted the side of his face. "I'm not here to hurt you. Stay back," Maya warned, raising the poker. "I mean it." "I know you do." He took a careful step forward. "My name's Frank Morrison. I've been living in these mountains for about 3 years now, and last night I saved your life." Maya's grip on the poker didn't loosen. "What are you talking about?" Frank gestured toward the blood-stained snow. "Those men who came looking for you. 3 of them, all armed. They would have found you eventually if I hadn't intervened. I did what I had to do." His voice was steady, matter-of-fact. "Same as you've been doing, I imagine. We all have our reasons for being up here, away from the world down there." The wind picked up, sending snow spiraling between them. Maya shivered, suddenly aware of how exposed she was standing in the open. But she couldn't bring herself to trust this stranger, no matter how grandfatherly he seemed. "How do I know you're not with them?" she asked. Frank smiled sadly. "Because if I was, you'd already be dead. Or worse." He pulled something from his pocket, a wallet, and tossed it gently toward her feet. "That belonged to the man I killed. Take a look." Maya kept her eyes on Frank as she bent to retrieve the wallet. Inside, she found a driver's license, credit cards, and a business card that made her blood run cold. Blackthorn Security Services. Marcus Webb's company. "Marcus sent them," she whispered. "Your husband, I'm guessing?" Frank's expression darkened. What kind of man sends armed mercenaries after his pregnant wife? The kind who has too much to lose if certain information comes to light. Maya dropped the wallet as if it had burned her. How many more are there? Hard to say, but they'll keep coming. Men like that don't give up easy. The baby kicked again, stronger this time, and Maya had to lean against the cabin wall for support. She was 7 months along now, too far to travel easily, too close to delivery to keep running indefinitely. But what choice did she have? "There's another cabin," Frank said, as if reading her thoughts. "About 2 miles north of here, better hidden, more defensible. I can take you there, help you get settled before—" He gestured toward her belly. "Why would you help me?" Frank was quiet for a long moment, staring at the blood in the snow. "Let's just say I know what it's like to have the past catch up with you, and sometimes helping someone else is the only way to live with what you've done." Maya looked at the wallet again, then at the forest beyond. Somewhere out there, more of Marcus's men were coming. She could feel it in her bones, the same instinct that had kept her alive this long. She made her decision. The blizzard had been raging for 3 days, turning the world outside into a white void that swallowed everything beyond the cabin's frosted windows. Sarah pressed her palm against her swollen belly, feeling the baby's restless movements as another contraction rippled through her lower back. They were still irregular but stronger than before. She couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching the cabin. It started yesterday evening, a prickling sensation between her shoulder blades whenever she moved past the windows. She'd convinced herself it was paranoia, a side effect of isolation and pregnancy hormones. But when she'd glimpsed a dark shape moving between the pine trees at dawn, barely visible through the swirling snow, her blood had turned to ice. They'd found her. Sarah limped to the kitchen, her injured ankle still tender from her fall down the ravine weeks ago. The shotgun Marcus had left behind leaned against the wall beside the stove, loaded and ready. She'd practiced with it every day since he'd gone to town for supplies, though her growing belly made it increasingly difficult to handle properly. Marcus should have been back 2 days ago. Another contraction seized her, stronger this time, and she gripped the counter until her knuckles went white. The baby was coming, whether she was ready or not, whether it was safe or not. A branch snapped outside, too loud and deliberate to be natural. Sarah grabbed the shotgun and crept to the front window, staying low. The storm made visibility almost impossible, but she caught a flash of dark clothing moving between the trees, then another, from a different direction. At least 2 of them, maybe more. Her hands trembled as she checked the gun's safety. Vincent had always been patient when he hunted. He'd watch and wait, learning his prey's patterns before moving in for the kill. She'd seen him do it to his business rivals, to anyone who crossed him. Now she was the prey. The baby kicked hard, as if sensing her fear. Sarah whispered to her belly, "Not yet, little one. Mommy needs a few more hours." She'd prepared for this scenario, though she'd hoped it would never come. The cabin had a root cellar accessible through a hidden trapdoor beneath the kitchen table. It wasn't comfortable, but it was concealed and stocked with emergency supplies. If she could hide long enough, maybe they'd give up and leave. They were inside. Sarah grabbed the emergency bag she'd packed weeks ago and lowered herself into the cellar, pulling the trapdoor shut above her head, just as heavy footsteps entered the kitchen. The space was cramped and musty, barely large enough for her to sit upright, but Marcus had insulated it well. Sound from above was muffled. She heard voices, too quiet to make out words, drawers being pulled open, furniture moved around. They were searching methodically, looking for clues about where she might have gone. A contraction hit her like a sledgehammer, and she bit down on her sleeve to muffle any sound. The baby was definitely coming. She could feel the pressure building, her body preparing whether her mind was ready or not. Footsteps passed directly overhead. Someone was standing on the trapdoor. "Kitchen's clear," a man's voice called out, muffled but audible. No sign of recent cooking. "Place looks abandoned." Blood on the bedroom floor. Another voice responded from deeper in the cabin. "Not much, but fresh. She was here." Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. The blood was from when she'd cut her hand on a broken jar the previous morning. Just a small accident, but apparently enough to give her away. "Storm's getting worse," the first voice said. "If she's out there, she's probably dead already. Vincent wants proof. We keep looking until we find a body." The footsteps moved away, heading toward the back of the cabin. Sarah allowed herself to breathe again, though each breath felt like fire in her lungs. She reached for the emergency supplies, her fingers finding the flashlight, medical kit, and bottled water Marcus had stored down here. Another contraction crashed over her, stronger than all the others. This time, she felt something shift inside her body, a sensation she recognized from all the books she'd read. Her water had broken. The baby was coming now, whether Vincent's men were 20 feet away or not. The wind howled through the trees like a living thing, rattling the cabin's windows as Maya pressed herself against the cold stone wall beside the front door. Her heart hammered against her ribs, so hard she was certain it would give her away. Through the gap in the curtains, she could see the beam of a flashlight cutting through the darkness, sweeping back and forth across the clearing. They had found her. The baby kicked frantically, as if sensing the danger that surrounded them. Maya placed a trembling hand over her swollen belly, trying to calm both herself and the child within. 8.5 months pregnant, and she was about to run for her life again. The footsteps crunched closer through the snow, deliberate and methodical. 2 sets, maybe 3. Maya's breath came in short, visible puffs in the frigid air. She had let the fire die hours ago when she first heard the distant sound of engines on the mountain road below. Now the cabin was as cold as a tomb, but at least it appeared abandoned. "Check the perimeter," a voice called out. "Male, gravelly, unfamiliar. Look for recent tracks." Maya's blood turned to ice. She recognized the authority in that tone, the military precision. These weren't local police or concerned citizens. These were Marcus's men, and they had come to finish what he had started. She eased away from the wall and crept toward the back of the cabin, her sock-covered feet silent on the wooden floor. The floorboards she had learned to avoid over the past weeks, the ones that creaked and groaned, were mapped in her memory now. Survival had taught her to be a ghost in her own temporary home. The back door was her only escape route, but it meant venturing into the woods in sub-zero temperatures, pregnant and with limited supplies. The alternative was waiting here like a trapped animal for them to break down the door. "Got tracks here," another voice called from somewhere near the woodshed. "Recent, maybe a day old." Maya's escape window was closing fast. She grabbed the emergency backpack she had kept packed by the door, a few cans of food, matches, the last of her cash, and the ultrasound photo that was her only connection to hope. The sleeping bag would have to stay behind, too bulky, and she needed to move fast. She eased the back door open inch by agonizing inch, wincing as the old hinges whispered their protest. The wind immediately cut through her layers of clothing like knives, and she bit back a gasp. The temperature had dropped even further since sunset. "Movement around back," someone shouted. Maya's careful escape plan evaporated. She pushed through the door and ran, her boots sliding on the icy ground as she made for the tree line. Behind her, she heard shouting, the crash of the front door being kicked in, and then the pursuit began in earnest. The forest was a maze of shadows and obstacles. Branches tore at her coat, and roots tried to trip her with every step. Her lungs burned in the thin mountain air, and the baby's weight threw off her balance, but she pushed deeper into the woods. She had spent weeks learning these trails, gathering firewood and searching for anything edible. Now that knowledge might save both their lives. She climbed steadily, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Each step sent shooting pains through her lower back, and she could feel the baby shifting restlessly, protesting the jarring movement. "Not now," she pleaded silently. "Not yet." The voices behind her were growing fainter, but she knew it was temporary. These weren't men who would give up easily. They would regroup, call for backup, maybe even bring dogs. She had to find shelter and fast, somewhere they wouldn't think to look. Then she remembered the old mine shaft Jake had warned her about during one of his supply runs. Dangerous, he had said, probably unstable. But it was hidden behind a rockfall about 2 miles up the ridge, and it would be warm enough to keep her alive until she could figure out her next move. Maya adjusted her backpack and pressed on, each step taking her further from the relative safety of the cabin and deeper into the unforgiving wilderness. The baby kicked again, a strong, determined movement that somehow felt like encouragement. She wasn't just running for herself anymore, she was running for both of them, and she would not let Marcus win. Not tonight. Not ever. The mine shaft waited somewhere ahead in the darkness, and with it, perhaps, one more chance at survival. The contractions came harder now, gripping Elena's body with a force that made her gasp and clutch the rough wooden beam above the hiding place. She pressed her face against the dusty floorboards, trying to muffle any sound as footsteps echoed through the cabin below. Marcus's voice drifted up through the cracks, cold and methodical as he directed his men through their search. "Check every room again. She's here somewhere. Pregnant women don't just vanish into thin air." Elena bit down on her sleeve, tasting blood as another wave of pain crashed over her. The baby was coming whether she wanted it to or not, and timing had never been her enemy's strong suit. Through the gaps in the floorboards, she could see the beam of a flashlight sweeping across the main room. One of Marcus's men stood directly below her, close enough that she could smell his cigarette smoke drifting upward. The contractions were barely 3 minutes apart now. She'd been timing them obsessively, knowing that once they reached 2 minutes, there would be no turning back. Her water had broken an hour ago, seeping silently into the old insulation beneath her. The irony wasn't lost on her. After weeks of preparing for this moment, mapping out the safest route to the nearest hospital, stockpiling supplies, she was about to give birth in the cramped space between floors while killers searched for her below. "Boss, there's something weird about this place," one of the men called out. Elena recognized the voice. Tommy, Marcus's newest recruit, young and eager to prove himself. Food's fresh in the kitchen, coffee pot still warm. Elena's heart hammered against her ribs. She'd been so careful about covering her tracks, but the sudden onset of labor had made her sloppy. She'd left evidence of her presence scattered throughout the cabin like breadcrumbs leading straight to her. "I told you she was here." Marcus's voice carried a note of satisfaction that made Elena's skin crawl. "Fan out. Check the perimeter. She can't have gone far." As the footsteps dispersed, Elena allowed herself a moment of relief, but it was short-lived as another contraction seized her, stronger than before. She could feel the baby moving lower, her body preparing for the final stage, whether her mind was ready or not. She pressed her hand against her mouth, feeling tears stream down her face as the pain intensified. The floorboards creaked ominously as someone walked directly over her hiding spot. Elena held her breath, willing her body to stay silent, but nature had its own agenda. A soft whimper escaped her lips, barely audible, but enough to make the footsteps above pause. "Did you hear that?" Tommy's voice was uncertain. "Hear what?" Marcus sounded irritated. "Thought I heard something, like crying or something." Elena closed her eyes, knowing that discovery was inevitable now. The contractions were coming too fast, too strong for her to maintain complete silence. She could feel the baby crowning, and instinct began to override everything else. Her body wanted to push, needed to push, and all the willpower in the world wouldn't stop what was happening. "Check the attic," Marcus ordered. Elena heard the scraping of a chair being dragged across the floor, then footsteps on the ladder leading to the space above her. She was sandwiched between 2 levels of the cabin now, with armed men both above and below. The baby was coming whether she was ready or not, and she had perhaps minutes before someone discovered her location. She reached into the small bag she'd managed to grab during her escape, her fingers finding the pistol she'd taken from the cabin's previous occupant. 6 bullets. She'd counted them a dozen times, knowing she'd need to make every shot count if it came to this. The weight of the weapon in her hands felt both comforting and terrifying. Another contraction hit, and this time Elena couldn't hold back a soft cry. The sound echoed in the confined space, and she heard the footsteps above freeze. "Marcus!" Tommy's voice was excited now. "There's someone in the walls." The response was immediate. Shouting, running footsteps, the sound of furniture being overturned as they searched for access to her hiding place. Elena knew she had seconds before they found the entrance panel she'd crawled through hours earlier. She positioned herself as best she could in the cramped space, gun in one hand, the other supporting her body as another wave of labor pains hit. The baby was coming now, ready or not, and she could feel the crown of its head beginning to emerge. The sound of splintering wood filled the air as someone began prying at the wall panels. Light flooded into her hiding space as the boards gave way, and Elena found herself staring into Tommy's surprised face. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Tommy opened his mouth to shout, and Elena pulled the trigger. The radio crackled to life at 4:47 a.m., jerking Sarah from a restless sleep. Static filled the cabin, then Marcus's voice cut through the white noise like a blade. "I know you're listening, Sarah. I know you're out there in those mountains, scared and alone with my child." His words dripped with false concern, the same tone he'd used when explaining away her bruises to concerned neighbors. "This has gone on long enough. Come home, and we can work this out like civilized people." Sarah's hand instinctively moved to her belly, where the baby kicked as if responding to its father's voice. She'd been monitoring the radio frequencies for days, expecting this moment but still unprepared for the chill that ran down her spine. "You've caused quite a stir, disappearing like that. The police are very concerned about your mental state. Dr. Brennan thinks the pregnancy hormones might be affecting your judgment." The practiced manipulation in his voice made her stomach turn. "But I told them you're stronger than that. You're smart enough to know when you're beaten." Sarah reached for the radio with trembling fingers, then stopped herself. He was baiting her, trying to get her to reveal her location. She pulled her hand back and listened. "The weather's turning bad up there. Forecast says there's a storm system moving in that'll drop temperatures below freezing for the next week. That's dangerous for you and the baby." He paused, letting the threat sink in. "I've got search teams positioned at every access road, thermal imaging equipment, dogs. You can't run forever, Sarah." Through the cabin windows, she could see the first grey hints of dawn struggling through heavy clouds. He was right about the weather. The barometric pressure had been dropping all night, and the wind carried the smell of snow. "Your friend Elena sends her regards, by the way." Sarah's blood turned to ice. "She's been very helpful, telling us about all those late-night conversations you two had, about the cabin, about how you thought you could just disappear." His laugh was cold, mechanical. "Poor Elena. She really thought she was protecting you by staying quiet at first. But everybody breaks eventually." Sarah closed her eyes, guilt and terror warring in her chest. Elena had a family, children of her own. Marcus would have used them as leverage, just like he was using the baby now. "You always were too trusting, Sarah. Too willing to believe that people would keep your secrets. But secrets have a way of coming to light, especially when the right pressure is applied." The mention of Dr. Martinez sent another spike of fear through Sarah's heart. Marcus had found out about the therapy sessions she'd hidden from him, the ones where she'd finally started to understand what he was doing to her wasn't normal, wasn't love. "The teams will start their final sweep at sunrise. That gives you maybe an hour to make the smart choice. Walk down to any of the access roads with your hands visible, and this ends peacefully. Keep running and, well, mountain rescues can be dangerous. Accidents happen, equipment fails, sometimes people just disappear forever." The threat was crystal clear. If she didn't surrender, he'd make sure she had an accident that would remove both her and the inconvenient witness she carried. Sarah stood on unsteady legs and moved to the window. In the growing light, she could see movement in the tree line below, dark figures moving with purpose between the pines. They'd found her general area. 1 hour, Sarah. Then this gets much harder for everyone involved. The radio went dead, leaving only the whisper of wind through the cabin's walls and the thundering of her own heartbeat. She pressed both hands against her belly, feeling the baby's movements, strong and insistent. "I won't let him hurt you," she whispered. "I won't let him turn you into what he tried to make me." But as she watched more figures emerge from the forest, she realized that good intentions might not be enough. She had an hour before they closed the net completely, an hour to find another way out, or to make her final stand. The baby kicked again, and Sarah took it as agreement. They weren't giving up. Not now, not ever. The storm had passed, leaving behind a crystalline world that sparkled under the weak morning sun. Maya pressed her face against the cabin's frost-covered window, her breath fogging the glass as she watched 2 figures emerge from the tree line below. Her blood turned to ice. Marcus had found her. Even from this distance, she recognized his purposeful stride, the way he held his shoulders rigid with barely contained rage. The man beside him was unfamiliar, broad-shouldered and methodical in his movements, likely another one of Marcus's associates. They moved with the confidence of predators who knew their prey was cornered. Maya's hand instinctively went to her rounded belly. At 8 months pregnant, running was no longer an option. The baby shifted restlessly inside her, as if sensing her terror. She had maybe 10 minutes before they reached the cabin, maybe less if they picked up their pace. Her mind raced through possibilities. The back door led to a steep drop-off, impossible to navigate in her condition. The root cellar beneath the kitchen floorboards was too small, and they'd find her easily. The loft above held old hunting equipment, but the ladder would be treacherous. A contraction seized her abdomen without warning, doubling her over. She gripped the windowsill, breathing through the pain, as she'd learned in those precious few prenatal classes she'd managed to attend before everything fell apart. Not now. The baby couldn't come now. The contraction subsided, leaving her shaky but determined. She'd survived 3 weeks in this wilderness prison, rationing canned goods and melting snow for water. She'd endured sub-zero nights when the fire died to embers, when hypothermia seemed like a gentler fate than what Marcus would do if he caught her. She wouldn't surrender now. Maya grabbed the hunting rifle she'd found in the loft weeks ago. It held 2 shells. She'd checked repeatedly, hoping to find more ammunition hidden somewhere in the cabin's sparse supplies. 2 chances. She positioned herself behind the overturned table she'd used as a barricade, angling it to protect her from the front door while giving her a clear line of sight. Through the window, she could see them ascending the narrow path, no longer bothering with stealth. Marcus called out, his voice carrying across the snow-muffled landscape. "Maya, I know you're in there. We can do this the easy way." There had never been an easy way with Marcus. Even before she'd discovered what he really was, before she'd seen the photos on his computer, before she'd understood why he traveled so frequently and why certain news stories made him smile, there had been an undercurrent of menace in their relationship. She'd mistaken his possessiveness for protection, his isolation tactics for devotion. Another contraction gripped her, stronger this time. She bit her lip to keep from crying out, tasting blood. The baby was coming whether she was ready or not. Her body had made that decision for her. "The feds are already closing in on your little empire," she called back, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. "That flash drive I took? It's already been copied, sent to people who know what to do with it." It was a lie, but a convincing one. The flash drive was hidden in the cabin's chimney, wrapped in plastic and wedged behind a loose stone. She'd planned to mail it to the FBI once she reached civilization, once the baby was born and she could think clearly again. But Marcus didn't need to know that. She heard him curse, then the low murmur of conversation with his companion. They were strategizing, probably planning to circle the cabin and attack from multiple angles. The smart thing would be to burn her out, but Marcus wanted that drive, and fire would destroy it. The front door exploded inward with a thunderous crack. Maya didn't hesitate. She fired through the splintered wood, aiming low. A scream of pain and a stream of profanity told her she'd hit something vital. 1 shell left. "You always were too clever for your own good," Marcus snarled, his voice strained with pain but still too close, too confident. "But you can't hide forever. Think about the baby, Maya. Think about what kind of life you're condemning it to." The cruel irony wasn't lost on her. She was thinking about the baby. Every decision she'd made since discovering his true nature had been about protecting this child from the monster she'd unknowingly chosen as its father. Another contraction, this one accompanied by a warm gush of fluid that soaked through her jeans. Her water had broken. There was no stopping this now, no negotiating with biology. The baby would be born in this cabin, in the middle of a standoff that would likely end with all of them dead. She shifted behind the table, trying to find a position that didn't amplify the growing pressure in her pelvis. Through the shattered doorway, she could see movement, a shadow that didn't belong to the scattered furniture. Marcus was inside, wounded but still dangerous, still hunting. Maya raised the rifle one final time, her finger steady on the trigger, waiting. The first rays of dawn painted the snow-covered peaks in shades of rose and gold as Maya cradled her newborn daughter against her chest. The baby's tiny fingers curled around hers, so perfect and impossibly small. Through the cabin's cracked window, she could see the valley spreading below like a white ocean, peaceful and untouched. But the peace was deceptive. Maya knew Marcus would come. She'd managed 3 hours of fitful sleep after the birth, her body screaming with exhaustion while her mind refused to quiet. Every creak of the old cabin, every whisper of wind through the pines sent adrenaline coursing through her veins. The baby, she'd decided to call her Hope, seemed to sense her mother's tension, fussing whenever Maya tried to set her down. The radio Elena had left crackled to life from the kitchen counter. Maya struggled to her feet, her legs unsteady, and hobbled over to answer. "Maya?" Elena's voice was tight with urgency. "Are you there?" "I'm here." Maya's voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. "How's the baby?" "She's perfect." "Elena, I can't thank you enough." "Listen to me carefully," Elena interrupted. "There are vehicles headed up the mountain road. 3 black SUVs. They're moving slow, checking every turnoff." Maya's blood turned to ice. Through the window, the peaceful valley suddenly felt like a trap, the mountains closing in around her. "How far out?" 20 minutes, maybe less. "Maya, you need to move. Now." The baby began to cry, as if sensing the danger. Maya pressed her close, trying to think through the fog of exhaustion and fear. She was in no condition to run through the snow with a newborn, but staying meant certain death, for both of them. "There's a hunting shelter about 2 miles north," Elena continued. "Follow the ridgeline past the fallen oak. It's hidden in a grove of aspens. Can you make it?" Maya looked down at Hope, so tiny and fragile. The temperature outside was well below freezing. The baby wouldn't survive an hour in this cold. "I don't have proper clothes for her. No blanket, nothing. Use everything you can find in the cabin. Strip the bed, wrap her against your skin. Maya, you have to try." The sound of engines reached her ears, still distant but growing closer. Maya's heart hammered against her ribs. She thought of Marcus, of the cold fury in his eyes the last time she'd seen him. He'd told her then that she belonged to him, that he'd find her no matter where she ran. She'd been naive to think the mountains could hide her forever. "Elena, if something happens to me, nothing's going to happen. You're stronger than you know." Maya began moving, tearing sheets from the bed with one hand while clutching Hope with the other. She wrapped the baby against her chest, layer upon layer, until only her tiny face was visible. Her coat barely zipped over the bulk, but it would have to do. The engine sounds were closer now, echoing off the canyon walls. Through the window, she caught a glint of sunlight on metal far below. They'd found the access road. She slipped out the back door into the brutal cold. The snow was knee-deep, and each step sent fire shooting through her torn body. Hope whimpered against her chest, the sound muffled by the layers of cloth. Maya pressed forward, following the ridgeline Elena had described. Behind her, she heard doors slamming, voices carrying on the thin mountain air. They'd reached the cabin. She had minutes at most before they discovered her trail in the snow. The fallen oak loomed ahead, a massive trunk blocking her path. Maya climbed over it, biting back a scream as the effort tore at her healing wounds. Blood seeped through her clothes, leaving spots of crimson in the pristine snow. The grove of aspens appeared through the trees like a mirage. The hunting shelter was little more than a lean-to, but it was hidden, camouflaged by years of fallen branches and accumulated snow. Maya crawled inside just as Hope's cries began in earnest. "Shh, baby, please," Maya whispered, rocking her gently. The sound would carry in the thin air, a beacon for anyone listening. She pressed her finger to the baby's lips, tears freezing on her cheeks. Footsteps crunched through the snow somewhere behind them, multiple sets spreading out to search. Maya held her breath, her entire world narrowing to the warm weight of her daughter against her chest. "She can't have gone far," Marcus's voice cut through the silence like a blade. "Not with a newborn. Check every tree, every rock." "She's here somewhere." Maya closed her eyes, feeling Hope's heartbeat against her own. They'd come so far, survived so much. She thought of all the women who'd tried to escape before her, all the ones who'd failed, but they hadn't had hope. They hadn't had something worth dying for. The footsteps moved closer, and Maya prepared to make her final stand.